July 18, 1995. Łask Air Base, Poland. The morning air is clear over central Poland as Major Andrzej Kowalski straps into his MiG-29 Fulcrum fighter for what should be a routine training exercise with visiting American F-16 pilots. Kowalski has flown the MiG-29 for 7 years, accumulating over 1,000 hours in the aircraft through countless training sorties and air defense alert missions. He's studied American fighter tactics through Soviet intelligence assessments, practiced against simulated F-16 performance profiles, and trained with doctrines specifically developed to counter Western air superiority fighters. This morning, this exercise represents something new, the first opportunity since the Cold War ended for Polish pilots to actually fly against American F-16s rather than theoretical models of them. Kowalski climbs to 15,000 feet, completes his systems checks, and waits for the exercise controller to clear him for the engagement. The American F-16C, approaching from the opposite direction, is flown by Captain Mark Stevens, a United States Air Force pilot with the 52nd Fighter Wing based in Germany. The two aircraft, close to within visual range, and the simulated engagement begins. Kowalski executes exactly what Soviet doctrine teaches for this scenario. He pulls his MiG-29 into a hard left turn, loading 7 Gs on the aircraft's structure, the maximum sustained load the Fulcrum can handle without risking structural damage. The turn is tight, the radius small, forcing the American fighter to either match the turn or extend away to preserve energy. Soviet doctrine predicts that Western fighters, built with safety margins and conservative structural limits, will extend rather than risk high G maneuvering at the edge of their performance envelope. Kowalski holds the turn, feeling the 7G force pressing him into his seat, watching his speed bleed from 450 knots down through 400, monitoring his lift vector to maintain optimal turn performance. He's done this maneuver hundreds of times in training, perfected the technique, knows exactly how his aircraft responds. What happens next doesn't match anything his training predicted. The F-16 doesn't extend. It turns inside Kowalski's turn radius, not slightly inside, significantly inside, cutting across Kowalski's flight path with angles that seem impossible. The American fighter is pulling tighter, turning faster, maintaining energy better. Kowalski can see vapor condensation streaming from the F-16's wing surfaces, visible evidence of the aerodynamic forces being generated, and he realizes the American pilot is sustaining turns his MiG-29 simply cannot match. Kowalski attempts a defensive brake, reversing his turn to force an overshoot, but the F-16 reverses with him and tightens even further inside. 40 seconds after the engagement began, Captain Stevens achieves simulated missile parameters. The fight is over. Kowalski has been comprehensively outmaneuvered by an aircraft doing things he was taught were aerodynamically impossible. When he lands and climbs out of his cockpit, his assessment to fellow Polish pilots waiting for their own exercise sorties is immediate. This aircraft breaks the laws of physics as I understand them. Everything we were taught about F-16 limitations is wrong. This is not the fighter we trained to face. To understand Warsaw Pact confidence in MiG-29 capability, you need to understand what Soviet designers created and what Soviet doctrine taught about it. The Mikoyan MiG-29 Fulcrum entered Soviet Air Force service in 1983, designed specifically as the Soviet answer to American fourth-generation fighters like the F-15 Eagle and F-16 Fighting Falcon. Soviet engineers studied American fighter development and concluded they needed an aircraft that could match Western performance in air superiority missions while maintaining the ruggedness and operational simplicity that Soviet doctrine emphasized. The MiG-29 that emerged was impressive by Soviet standards. A twin-engine fighter capable of Mach 2.25, equipped with a sophisticated helmet-mounted targeting system that allowed pilots to designate targets simply by looking at them, and armed with the R-73 Archer missile that could engage aircraft at extreme off-bore sight angles impossible for earlier generation weapons. Soviet propaganda and Warsaw Pact training doctrine taught that MiG-29 equaled or exceeded Western fighter capabilities. The aircraft could reach higher speeds than F-16, carried more internal fuel, and its helmet-mounted sight provided targeting advantages that Western fighters lacked in the 1980s. Warsaw Pact pilots trained with confidence that their MiG-29s gave them competitive capability against any Western fighter they might encounter. Soviet air combat doctrine emphasized aggressive maneuvering and close-range engagements where the MiG-29's helmet sight and R-73 missile would prove decisive. Polish, East German, Czech, and Romanian pilots absorbed this doctrine, practiced these tactics, and believed they flew fighters that could hold their own against American aircraft. The reality contained limitations that Soviet doctrine downplayed or ignored. The MiG-29's maximum sustained turn loading was 7 Gs. The aircraft's structure could handle brief excursions to higher G loads, but sustained 7G turns represented the performance limit that pilots couldn't exceed without risking structural damage. At certain speed regimes, particularly at high speeds above 500 knots or low speeds below 250 knots, the aircraft's turn performance degraded significantly, with sustained G-loads dropping to 5 or 6 G as aerodynamic or structural constraints limited performance. The control system was analog, meaning the pilot directly controlled flight surfaces through hydraulic linkages with artificial feel systems that provided tactile feedback. This approach worked, but required pilots to carefully manage the aircraft to avoid stalls, spins, or pilot-induced oscillations, where control inputs created unstable flight conditions. The cockpit visibility was good forward and to the sides, but poor to the rear, where the aircraft's structural design created blind spots that made it difficult to maintain awareness of threats approaching from behind. What Warsaw Pact pilots couldn't know until they actually flew against F-16s in exercises, was just how significant these limitations were compared to American fighter capabilities. The F-16 Fighting Falcon represented a revolutionary approach to fighter design that created performance advantages far exceeding what Soviet intelligence had estimated. Development of the F-16 began in the early 1970s when the United States Air Force sought a lightweight fighter to complement the heavier, more expensive F-15 Eagle. General Dynamics won the competition with a design that incorporated revolutionary technologies. The first YF-16 prototype took flight on January 20th, 1974, and immediately demonstrated capabilities that surprised even its designers. The production F-16A entered operational service with the Air Force in 1979, and NATO allies began receiving aircraft shortly thereafter. By the mid-1980s, F-16s equipped multiple American and Allied fighter wings, providing the backbone of NATO tactical air power. The technology that made F-16 revolutionary started with fly-by-wire flight control. Previous generation fighters used mechanical or hydraulic linkages, connecting the pilot's control stick directly to the aircraft's flight control surfaces. The F-16 eliminated those physical connections. When the F-16 pilot moved the control stick, sensors measured the movement and sent electrical signals to a flight control computer. The computer interpreted the pilot's inputs, calculated the optimal flight control surface positions to achieve the desired aircraft response, and commanded hydraulic actuators to move the surfaces accordingly. This approach provided multiple advantages. The computer could make control adjustments faster than any mechanical system, responding to changing flight conditions in milliseconds. The computer could prevent pilots from inadvertently commanding maneuvers that would cause stalls or spins, allowing pilots to push the aircraft to its absolute performance limits without fear of losing control. Most importantly, the computer could coordinate multiple control surfaces simultaneously to achieve maneuvers impossible with conventional control approaches. The result was 9G sustained turn capability at virtually any speed within the F-16's flight envelope. 9 Gs, a turn so tight that the human body becomes the limiting factor before the aircraft reaches its structural or aerodynamic limits. F-16 pilots wearing G-suits and trained in anti-G straining maneuvers could sustain 9G turns, but the physical stress was severe enough that maintaining such turns for extended periods caused fatigue and sometimes loss of consciousness. The aircraft itself could maintain 9G loading indefinitely without structural stress. MiG-29 pilots watching F-16s maneuver for the first time couldn't believe what they were seeing: turn radii, and turn rates that seemed to violate basic aerodynamic principles they'd been taught throughout their training. The F-16's blended wing body design contributed substantially to this performance. Rather than designing a conventional fuselage with wings attached to it, General Dynamics engineers blended the wing and fuselage into a single integrated lifting surface. This configuration generated approximately 40% more lift than conventional aircraft designs of similar size, allowing the F-16 to maintain energy during high G turns, where conventional fighters would rapidly bleed speed. The aircraft could sustain 9G turns while maintaining speeds that kept it in optimal performance regions, whereas the MiG-29 would slow dramatically during sustained 7G turns and lose the energy necessary to continue maneuvering. The pilot interface represented another revolutionary advance. The F-16 employed a side stick controller mounted on the right console beside the pilot's seat, rather than a conventional center stick between the pilot and his legs. The side stick required minimal movement, slight pressure inputs rather than large stick deflections, allowing the pilot to command aggressive maneuvers with almost no physical motion. The pilot's left hand remained on the throttle, which incorporated multiple controls, allowing weapon selection, radar management, and system commands without requiring the pilot to look down at cockpit switches or remove their hand from the throttle. This hands-on throttle and stick approach, abbreviated HOTAS, meant F-16 pilots could manage complex tactical situations while maintaining visual contact outside the cockpit and keeping both hands on primary flight controls. MiG-29 pilots used conventional control layouts, requiring them to look down at switches, move their hands away from throttle and stick to manage systems, and divide their attention between flying and systems management in ways that slowed reaction times and reduced situational awareness during high-intensity maneuvering. The F-16's bubble canopy provided 360-degree visibility with minimal structural obstruction. The pilot sat high in the cockpit with excellent views forward, to the sides, and to the rear. MiG-29 pilots had good forward visibility, but significant blind spots to the rear where structural framing and equipment obscured their view. In air combat, the ability to maintain visual contact with threats throughout the engagement proved critical. F-16 pilots could track opponents throughout maneuvering sequences, while MiG-29 pilots periodically lost visual contact with aircraft maneuvering behind them. The Pratt & Whitney F-100 turbofan engine powering the F-16A produced 25,000 pounds of thrust, giving the aircraft a thrust-to-weight ratio exceeding 1-to-1 under many operational conditions. This meant the F-16 could accelerate in vertical climbs, maintain energy during sustained turns, and recover speed rapidly after aggressive maneuvering. The engine's performance across the full flight envelope ensured the F-16 maintained excellent acceleration and energy management regardless of speed or altitude. Soviet engines were powerful, but generally optimized for specific flight regimes, with performance degrading at certain speed or altitude conditions. The difference meant F-16 pilots could sustain high-performance maneuvering longer, while MiG-29 pilots found their aircraft's performance varying significantly depending on flight conditions. When the Cold War ended and former Warsaw Pact nations began integrating with NATO, the opportunity finally arose for a direct comparison between F-16 and MiG-29 through joint training exercises. The results shocked Warsaw Pact pilots who had trained their entire careers, believing they flew competitive aircraft. Polish Air Force exercises with American F-16s throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s produced engagement ratios approaching 10-to-1 in favor of F-16s. For every 10 training engagements, F-16 pilots achieved simulated engagement parameters 9 or 10 times, while MiG-29 pilots succeeded once, or not at all. Romanian Air Force pilots flying MiG-29s against NATO F-16s reported similar results. These were inexperienced pilots making novice mistakes. These were seasoned aviators with thousands of hours of flight time executing tactics they'd trained with for years. The problem wasn't pilot skill, it was aircraft capability. Warsaw Pact pilots identified specific differences that created F-16 advantages in virtually every tactical situation. The F-16 sustained 9 G turns at any speed within its flight envelope, while the MiG-29 was limited to 7 Gs maximum and often less at certain speeds. During high G maneuvering that defined close-range dogfights, this difference was decisive. The F-16 could turn inside the MiG-29's turn radius, achieve higher instantaneous turn rates approaching 20 degrees per second, compared to the MiG-29's 17 degrees per second, and maintain these performance advantages throughout extended engagements. MiG-29 pilots executing maximum performance turns found F-16s consistently tightening inside their turn circles with angles that seemed impossible based on their understanding of fighter aerodynamics. Energy retention proved equally important. The F-16 maintained speed through maneuvers that caused MiG-29s to bleed energy rapidly. A sustained 7G turn in the MiG-29 might slow the aircraft from 450 knots down to 300 knots in 20 seconds of maneuvering, forcing the pilot to reduce G-loading to recover energy or risk falling into low-speed flight regimes, where performance degraded further. The F-16 could sustain 9 G-turns while maintaining speeds above 400 knots, preserving energy that kept the aircraft in optimal performance regions and allowed the pilot to sustain aggressive maneuvering indefinitely. Polish Major Kowalski, after flying multiple training engagements against F-16s, provided detailed debriefs to Polish Air Force leadership about the capability gaps he observed. His assessment was unambiguous. We trained our entire careers against theoretical F-16 capabilities derived from Soviet intelligence estimates. Those estimates were catastrophically optimistic. The reality of F-16 performance exceeds everything we were taught. When an F-16 pilot decides to maneuver, the aircraft responds immediately with turn rates and turn radii we cannot match. When we execute our maximum performance turns, F-16s turn inside us as if our aircraft are standing still. The pilot interface allows them to manage complex tactical situations while maintaining full attention on maneuvering. Our cockpit requires us to divide attention between flying and systems management in ways that slow our reactions. The fundamental capability gap cannot be overcome through better tactics or more training. The aircraft are simply not competitive with each other. Romanian MiG-29 pilots participating in NATO exercises provided similar testimonials. One Romanian squadron commander noted, "The MiG-29 is an impressive aircraft when evaluated on its own merits. It flies well, carries capable weapons, and our pilots execute their missions professionally. But when we fly against F-16s, we discover that impressive on its own merits is not the same as competitive with Western fighters." The F-16 operates in a different performance category. Our pilots do everything correctly according to our doctrine and training, and we still lose engagements consistently because the opposing aircraft can do things our aircraft cannot match. The technology gap that created these performance differences reflected fundamental design philosophy, differences between American and Soviet approaches to fighter development. Fly-by-wire flight control required confidence that computers could be trusted with flight-critical functions, a confidence that required advanced software engineering, reliable processors, and extensive validation testing. American aerospace industry had invested heavily in these technologies throughout the 1970s, developing flight control computers robust enough to operate reliably under the most demanding conditions. Soviet aerospace designers understood fly-by-wire concepts, but lacked confidence that Soviet computer technology could provide the reliability necessary for flight-critical applications. They continued using analog control systems with mechanical and hydraulic linkages that worked reliably, but imposed performance limitations that computer-controlled systems could overcome. The structural design differences reflected similar philosophical divergence. The F-16 was designed from the beginning to sustain 9G loading throughout its operational life. Every structural component was engineered for these loads, with safety factors built in to ensure the aircraft could handle brief excursions beyond 9Gs without damage. Soviet designers built the MiG-29 for 7G sustained loading, a more conservative specification that required less structural weight but imposed performance limits that Soviet doctrine accepted as adequate. The difference was that American designers believed maximum sustained maneuvering capability justified the engineering investment required to achieve it, while Soviet designers believed 7Gs provided sufficient performance and additional capability wasn't worth the added complexity and weight. The pilot interface reflected broader approaches to human-machine integration. American designers invested extensively in understanding how pilots interacted with complex systems under high workload conditions. The HOTAS controls, the heads-up display, the side-stick controller, each represented specific solutions to reducing pilot workload and allowing pilots to maintain maximum situational awareness during combat maneuvering. Soviet designers used more conventional approaches that worked but required pilots to manage systems through traditional cockpit layouts that divided attention and slowed reaction times. The F-16 Fighting Falcon became the most numerous Western fighter aircraft in history, with production exceeding 4,600 aircraft delivered to 25 nations. The aircraft remains in frontline service today in 2025, with modern variants like the F-16V equipped with active electronically scanned array radar and advanced avionics that extend capability far beyond original 1970 specifications. The United States Air Force plans to operate F-16s through the 2040s, and multiple allied nations continue upgrading their fleets rather than replacing them because the basic airframe design remains competitive with modern requirements. MiG-29 production ended in the 1990s as Soviet industry collapsed and demand evaporated. Most Warsaw Pact nations that operated MiG-29s during the Cold War have replaced them with F-16s purchased from the United States or other NATO allies. Poland retired its MiG-29 fleet and operates F-16C aircraft purchased from the United States. Romania followed similar path. Even Russia has limited its use of remaining MiG-29s to secondary roles while focusing modernization investment on more recent aircraft designs. The capability gap that exercises revealed in the 1990s has not narrowed. It's widened as F-16s receive continuous upgrades, while MiG-29s age without comparable modernization. The fly-by-wire technology that gave F-16 revolutionary advantages in 1979 has evolved into more sophisticated systems that integrate across multiple aircraft through data links and sensor fusion. The basic design principles that made F-16 superior to MiG-29, computer-controlled flight, optimized pilot interface, sustained high-G performance, have become fundamental requirements for modern fighter aircraft that every nation attempts to incorporate in new designs. When Major Kowalski landed after that first engagement with an American F-16 in 1995, he knew immediately that everything he'd been taught about Western fighter limitations was wrong. The aircraft he'd trained to fight didn't exist. The real F-16 maneuvered with capabilities that exceeded Soviet intelligence estimates by such margins that Warsaw Pact doctrine couldn't address the actual capability gap. The fly-by-wire flight controls allowed the aircraft to sustain turns that seemed physically impossible. The blended wing-body design maintained energy through maneuvers that would slow conventional fighters dramatically. The pilot interface allowed American pilots to manage complex tactical situations with reaction speeds Warsaw Pact pilots couldn't match using conventional cockpit layouts. The MiG-29 flew like a fighter, responsive to pilot inputs, capable within its performance envelope, competitive by Soviet standards. The F-16 flew like an extension of the pilot's thoughts, responding instantly to inputs, operating at the edge of physical possibility, creating advantages through technology that skill and tactics couldn't overcome. When those philosophies met in exercise, after exercise, throughout the 1990s and 2000s, only one outcome repeated consistently. Warsaw Pact pilots discovered they'd trained for a competition that was never actually close. MiG-29 flew like fighter. F-16 flew like extension of pilots' thoughts.